Hi there, this is Dara Star Tucker. Thank you so much for joining me for the All Over the Place podcast. This week, I have a conversation coming up with one of my favorite mutuals online. His name is Gerard LeConte. He's an incredible political commentator. If you don't already follow him, please do. His name is Gerard. His last name is spelled Leconte, Gerard LeConte. He is going to be a voice of reason and calm and wisdom during this election season. He's one of those folks that you just reach out to when crazy things are happening, and he helps to contextualize it. His very calm tone is something that I've come to count on through all the ups and downs of tumultuous political seasons like the one that we're in right now. So I would highly recommend that you follow Gerard LeConte. And of course, I'm going to remind you that if you are a regular listener to the podcast, the way that you can support us is to join the Patreon. That's a subscription service where you can contribute as little as $5 a month. Whatever's comfortable for you, you can go to patreon.com/Dara Star Tucker to become a patron. I also want to remind you to leave a review for the podcast on whatever platform that you listen on, whether it be Apple Podcasts or Spotify or YouTube. Giving the podcast a 5-star rating, leaving us a great review. It always helps us to come up just a little bit higher in the rankings when folks are looking for the next great podcast that they want to do a deep dive on. So rate the show if you would. I'm going to send you over to this week's episode, which, as you all know, is done in conjunction with my show on KJLH. Gerard and I are doing a deep dive on what I would call an evergreen topic, and that's the effect and the impact of misogyny on today's young men, and more specifically how the so-called alt-right has sought to take advantage of that and use it to their benefit. I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. Gerard has a lot of wisdom to offer in this area, and this honestly is one of my favorite kinds of episodes because Gerard and I got into a pretty extensive conversation, and we covered a lot of ground where this topic is concerned, and we kind of had to make the decision towards the end of the episode about exactly what the focus would be for the radio audience, which, as you all know, if you listen to the podcast weekly, the radio audience only gets a 25-minute version of this, but then I get to bring you all the full conversation, which oftentimes can go beyond 30 or 45 minutes. So you all are getting a much, much deeper context than what the radio audience would have. And that's the thing that I love about having a radio show that also has a podcast component to it. Now, I also want to mention that I have brought on a producer for the first time ever to help me out with putting this show together, and his name is Van Everett. He has been a wonderful addition to the podcast already. He started with the first episode of season 5, which was the Kamala Harris episode. So the really cool thing about having him here is that he gets to make those very difficult cuts, and he has to decide exactly what's going to end up on the radio versus the podcast episode. Those are always really hard decisions for me to make, and I hate leaving things on the cutting room floor. I'm so glad to say that that is no longer my challenge, but Van Everett is going to be taking that on now. So I want to welcome him to the quote unquote team. It's really just him and I putting this together, but I'm so glad to have him here and helping with the production process so that I can focus on the 1,000,001 other things that I have to do throughout the week. And he's already helping to lighten the load. I'm getting all sorts of interesting projects done around the house. So I'm so glad to have him here. Welcome to the All Over the Place podcast, Van. Van has a podcast himself called The Scenario. So if you would like to hear more from him, I would encourage you to seek that podcast out. So here it is for you now, the second episode of season 5 of the All Over the Place podcast featuring Gerard LeConte. Talk to you again next week. Well, hi there, folks. My name is Dara Star Tucker, and this is The Breakdown. Thank you so much for joining me here on KJLH. I'm glad to have you. I want to let you know where you can find me online. I am on Instagram at Dara Tucker B. You can find me on TikTok and all other platforms at Dara Star Tucker. That's Dara with 1 R and Star with 2. We have so much going on these days in terms of the election, and it's honestly a lot to keep up with. So part of what my focus is going to be for the rest of the year is just helping us to get more of a micro focus on some of the issues that really affect our day-to-day lives. And some of the macro issues, honestly, that really even extend beyond the election, because I know it's very easy for us to get caught up in who's doing what. Here's the next bombastic thing that was said or done. And then within 24 or 48 hours, everyone has moved on to the next thing. So I really want to help us to get focused on some of the issues that honestly we are dealing with, regardless of whether we are in an election year or not. And I recently saw a video by a TikTok and Instagram mutual of mine named Gerard LeConte, and you may recognize his name because he's been on the show before, where he sort of highlighted an issue that I have been greatly concerned with for a long time. And that's the toxic masculinity that has crept into specifically the conservative movement, the alt-right conservative movement these days. And I have a lot of observations about this. I have a lot of scattered thoughts about it, but Gerard just has this way of bringing it all into focus. And he did a very, very good and very informative video very recently on his TikTok and on his Instagram about this subject. And I kind of want to get in and do a deep dive with Gerard about this. So first, I want to introduce you to Gerard LeConte. Thank you so much for being here with us on The Breakdown. Thank you for being here. I'm so glad to have you back on the show.
The feeling is mutual. Thanks for having me back. It's wild to think that it was just a few weeks ago we were talking about whether or not Biden would stay in the race, and now it feels like an entirely new election. But,
and I kind of want to get into that with you. I want to ask you very quickly before we play your piece for the folks. I want to play that for them before we get into this discussion that we're here to have. First of all, Gerard, can you tell the audience where to find you?
Yep.
Online.
You can find me at Gerard.LeConte. That's GERARD.LECONTE on TikTok, or Gerard LeConte Politics on Instagram and Threads.
Okay, wonderful. Please find Gerard and follow him. He is always full of such just important, thoughtful information about the election, political analysis. I keep telling him he should be a political strategist. I think he could have been that or could be that in another life if he chooses to do so, which is why I'm having him back so soon. But I want to ask you very quickly before I play the piece for the folks, Gerard. So last time we talked, you were kind of one of those folks, and you went hard for Biden online, and I follow you on Threads. And if you're not on Threads, I would highly recommend it. It's a much more wholesome environment, I would say, than what X has become. But Gerard is very active on Threads. I've started posting there a lot more. And I noticed that a lot of your content there was really standing in defense of Biden. And I think you were making a very good case for why we maybe should not have jettisoned him, why the party kind of elites should not have jettisoned him in the way they did, but they did. And I had my concerns, as did a lot of people, but it actually seems to have turned out for the better, at least so far. So how are you feeling about that decision, Gerard?
Yeah, I think we ended that conversation actually by with me saying that I would probably feel slightly more optimistic if Harris was leading the ticket, but that there were a lot of legitimate risks involved with Biden leaving the ticket. With his decision to drop out of the race, we kind of got to play the experiment out and see what was going to happen. Mm-hmm. In retrospect, I think a lot of people have treated the last few weeks almost as if they were inevitable. I am happy that they've turned out the way that they have. I would hesitate to say that they were inevitable. I don't know about you, but I think it is absolutely remarkable that the Democratic coalition has coalesced around Harris in the way that they have, because let's just be honest, it's not normal behavior for us.
No, it's not.
It's not normal behavior for us at all. But it's been beautiful. I'm 35 years old. I was 18 years old when Barack Obama was running in 2008. And I haven't seen enthusiasm and energy like this since then. Yeah. It's really great. Harris has clearly grown so much since the 2020 primary, and she is right now putting on a masterclass of how to run an enthusiastic and energetic campaign. Can't wait to watch the next few months play out. However, I would like to mention that if you look at the polling data right now, everybody, when they were trying to push Biden out, was very focused on the polls. The polls are still showing it to be a very tight race. Mm-hmm. So, enthusiasm aside, we need to make sure that we're all doing the work and putting the messages out there and getting feet on the ground and making sure that we can turn out this enthusiasm.
Yeah, absolutely. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing. I mean, you're a pragmatist to your core, and I think I am as well. You have always been one that's acknowledged the challenges in every phase of this process that we're dealing with, but you're really focused on solutions. And so I know you're someone who is ready to get behind Kamala Harris 100%. I don't question that. Yeah, I did think of you in that process. You know, when I saw that he had finally made the decision not to run again, I thought, well, I wonder how Gerard's kind of feeling about this process. But I know you're enthusiastic about Kamala Harris's bid, as am I, and so I kind of want to though get into some of what you have been talking about online recently about some troubling things that you're seeing happening within the so-called alt-right movement, and I know that term in and of itself was coined, I believe, by a man named Richard Spencer, who is an avowed white supremacist. To even call it the alt-right versus calling it, I don't know, something much more insidious, which is what it is, might be kind of bending just a little bit to their messaging around what they are and are not. But I feel like this is a movement that has been growing. We're seeing numbers around how many young men are really being radicalized by the so-called alt-right these days. It's a concerning thing. It's not something that I know, really what to do with. I just know what it is that we're observing. I know that a lot of young men are responding to, and I think you do get into this in your piece, which we're going to play here right now. A lot of men are responding to the shifting dynamics in the culture by being, pushed further right, allowing themselves to be pushed further right. And so let me play the piece that you did, Gerard, on the alt-right movement and its influence particularly on young men. And we'll be back to talk about it.
The goal of right-wing media has been to make their audience antisocial for a while now, and it's pretty easy to see how they do it. They inundate them with increasingly extremist and deranged ideas, and then they encourage them to push those ideas onto the people in their lives, knowing that it's bound to alienate them. We saw an excellent example of this recently in an interview on Newsmax with Roseanne Barr.
And you've been talking to some of your Democrat friends. What was their reaction? Were they surprised that Biden pulled out of the race?
I still have Democrat kids. Oh, God help me. And my mom, too, is still a Democrat.
We've got to convert them, Roseanne.
I tried like hell. And my brother, my gay sister, they're all, I tried like hell. Now they don't even talk to me. I try to text them, and they don't even take my texts. Whatever.
Roseanne, we still love you here at Newsmax, so we're going to...
Becoming alienated from your friends and family is a tragedy, and it's one that many of us have seen in our own lives when a friend or family member falls down the right-wing disinformation hole. But it isn't an accident. Right-wing media outlets prime their audience to insulate themselves when they receive pushback from their families and communities around these ideas. They'll say stuff like, people are going to call you racist or sexist or generally treat you like a bad person because you believe these things, but you just know the truth and they can't handle it. But don't worry, we know you're right and we accept you. This is on purpose. They want people to rely on them not only for news and information, but also for identity and belonging. It makes it that much easier for them to radicalize them. This is nothing new. It's been a go-to strategy for cults, extremist groups, and multi-level marketing schemes forever, but bringing these tactics into news and news entertainment really was Roger Ailes' great innovation, and it's how he revolutionized right-wing media. Trump, like demagogues often do, brought these tactics into political campaigning, and it's continuing to be an evolving aspect to his campaign strategy this election cycle. In fact, that evolution helped motivate the decision to choose JD Vance as his running mate in a way that I think the political press has completely missed. Consider this.
But look, what I was basically saying is that we're effectively run in this country via the Democrats, via our corporate oligarchs, by a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives and the choices that they've made, and so they want to make the rest of the country miserable too. And it's just a basic fact. You look at Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, AOC, the entire future of the Democrats is controlled by people without children.
This clip has gotten a lot of play, particularly online, but mostly within the context of how misogynistic and sexist it is, and it is definitely both of those things. But the Trump campaign appears to have made a strategic decision to be a red pill campaign. And why is that? It's because young men are ripe for radicalization right now. What explains the rise of red pill and incel culture? Why are denigrations of single women, attacks on IVF, and appeals to traditional patriarchal nostalgia so effective right now? It's because the more pressure there is on women to be in a relationship with men, the less effort men have to put into being attractive to women. And that appeals to the subset of men who are extremely resentful about the cultural shift towards women having more agency about whether they're in a relationship and who they're in a relationship with, because they are lonely. And agency is an easy thing to blame for that loneliness. Now, I'm not sitting here saying that any of us should have a particular sympathy for men who have gone down an extremist, misogynist rabbit hole, but loneliness can destroy a culture. The United States is and has been for a few decades now experiencing a cultural crisis among men and around masculinity that is fundamentally rooted in loneliness. For centuries, men have found belonging in their status, and that status is changing, and many of us don't know how to handle it, and instead of handling it in a healthy and productive way, many of us have isolated and alienated ourselves from our friends, families, and communities, instead supplementing with superficial community built around rage about our loneliness. Instead of offering solutions to this serious problem, the Trump campaign sees an opportunity to capitalize on that loneliness. They see an opportunity for expedient radicalization. They see an opportunity to turn out a historically low propensity voting demographic and use it to gain more power. The left of center coalition should continue to search for more diverse and accessible ways to offer men, and especially young men, an off-ramp from this radicalization, an entry point back into community, a reprieve from loneliness that doesn't feel like these men are sacrificing their masculinity, because our current way of going about it is leaving a gap. It's a gap that we've seen grifters and fraudsters like Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson fill for years, but now it's a gap that Donald Trump is exploiting and pursuing more aggressively, and it's dangerous.
All right, so that is the piece that Gerard LeConte did on the influence of the right on young men, the radicalization of a lot of young men within the Republican Party specifically. Gerard, can you tell us more about maybe why you chose to do that piece right now? What are you observing in the culture that even put your attention and your focus on this phenomenon?
Yeah, and before we get too deep into it, I do want to acknowledge really quickly that we're about to cover some sensitive topics, and it's impossible to discuss this situation without using some pretty gendered language and without touching on one part of an intersectional experience that we all meet in our own ways. So I want to just kind of recognize and put out there that we're speaking from our personal experiences, and they're not always going to align with the audiences. And we're looking to have a thoughtful and mindful and honest conversation about this. We're not looking to offend anybody or leave anybody out. Mm-hmm. But what the primary reason why I felt it was an important time to talk about it is because, you know, you mentioned Richard Spencer earlier. He is a self-described white nationalist, but he's also a self-described chauvinist. And those two things often interplay. We often see chauvinism and misogyny alongside white supremacy and racism, but they are not necessarily the same thing, and they are not always necessarily targeting the same people. And what the selection of JD Vance as Donald Trump's running mate showed me was that the Trump campaign was leaning into the red pill culture, the manosphere, if you will, alt-right, in a way that we hadn't seen a major campaign do in the past. And it seemed to me that he was attempting to turn out what is a historically low propensity voter, which is young men, by appealing specifically to this red pill culture and by tapping into a disaffection and loneliness that we are seeing spread rapidly throughout young men. And I think that this is actually a really good opportunity, now that we have somebody on the main stage like JD Vance, to look at the effort to radicalize men and boys as a problem in of itself, and not necessarily just as a symptom of, for lack of a better term, toxic masculinity. I think when you compare this to, say, a lot of the work coming out right now by Jonathan Haidt, for example, on social media and the effects of how much time we're spending in digital spaces. When we look at the effects of Instagram, for example, on young women and girls, we look at it as something that is happening to them, and we treat it as a problem that is happening to them. But when we look at boys who are interacting with content from, say, someone like Andrew Tate, we look at it as a toxic masculinity problem. We look at it as a problem with the boys, and not necessarily a problem that's happening to the boys. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a very good opportunity, now that somebody like JD Vance and his extreme ideas about the world is on the stage. We have an opportunity to really look at it as a problem that's happening to young boys, and not necessarily looking at it as a problem of masculinity itself.
Mm-hmm. That's a really important distinction. And one of the reasons that I feel that even though I observe things like this, I'm not necessarily the person who should be addressing this right now, because I feel like that's an insight when you say we look at an issue that's happening with young women as something that's happening to them, versus how we look at something that is happening to young men as a problem with young men versus something that is being placed upon them by the culture. I would not necessarily put my head around this issue in that way, which is why it is so important, I think, for other men and young men, older men, to be speaking out about this right now, and why we maybe need to be letting you all kind of lead this conversation right now. So I'm so glad that you're focused on it, and a lot of other men right now are focused on it. So what are some of the ways that you're seeing this expressed in the culture, I guess? I'll go back to my initial question. And what is it that even prompted you to want to make that video in the first place?
So to be clear, misogyny in right-wing politics is nothing new. And in a lot of ways, JD Vance is not the first running mate chosen in an effort to appeal to misogyny. In a lot of ways, Mike Pence was also chosen for similar appeals. Let's not forget that Mike Pence famously refuses to have one-on-one dinners with women. And that is a function of misogyny, right? You should be just as comfortable having dinner with a woman as you would with a man. And fear around women is misogyny in of itself.
Interesting.
What we're seeing in this situation, though, is not necessarily an appeal to traditional ideas of gender relationships from the lens of maybe a Puritan view, like Mike Pence shows, but much more from a chauvinistic view. This idea that women are in society for a utility, not necessarily as humans in of themselves. They're here to build families, and we need them insofar as they are used to build families. And to the extent that society is not using them in that way, society is making a mistake, right? That is JD Vance's entire premise when he's talking about childless cat ladies ruining the country. He's basically saying, in slightly more creative language, that we wouldn't be having so many problems if women were just busy making babies instead of trying to run the country. And
I love how his clarification of that with, I don't remember if it was Laura Ingraham or Megyn, I think it was Megyn Kelly. His clarification of that was, people are so focused on the sarcasm of it when they don't understand the point behind it. And the point behind it was as awful, if not more awful, than the sarcasm itself. The overall point that he was making was just as bad.
And there was another interview where he responded to it, and he said, people are looking or reading into that far too much. Anybody who knows me knows I don't have any problem with cats. And why I think that is important is because he's trolling.
Yes.
He knows what he's doing. Yes. He knows who he's appealing to. And this is not an accident. This is not a matter of somebody that just has a different view of the world being misunderstood by PC culture or whatever. He's appealing to a specific chauvinistic and misogynistic idea of how social hierarchy should work. And the reason why, in my opinion, we are seeing it have so much traction in the last few years is it's a result of the loneliness epidemic that young men are experiencing. I saw a statistic recently that showed that about 1 in 5, somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4 men have zero friends that they feel like they could confide in about their emotions. That's a 5-fold increase from when the same question was studied in the 90s. And it's a notable increase over over young girls. I want to be clear that in so many ways, boys and men are doing so much better than they ever have. The fathers of my generation are so much different than our fathers, and the sons that we're raising are going to be so much different than we were raised.
Yes.
But it doesn't take that much to have a radicalized movement. And what we're seeing right now is a very extreme subculture that a lot of us, especially millennials, grew up with and saw on the fringes spill over into mainstream. And I think if we, frankly, I think if it wasn't men at the center of it, we would be much more concerned about it as a social justice issue than we are. Yeah. Because in a lot of ways, these are young men who don't really understand their way in the world, have not built the tools to connect authentically and genuinely with other people around them, have a very real and genuine loneliness as a result of that. And the folks like Andrew Tate, like Jordan Peterson, like JD Vance are looking to capitalize on that loneliness.
Well, I want to ask you 2 things, Gerard, and I'm trying to make sure and circle back and get an answer to the second part of this. And I don't want to forget to ask you about the second part of this. The second part of it is, or the second question I want to ask you is, a lot of folks, particularly that would be listening to a conversation like this, are not, as you mentioned, the chronically online types that are necessarily seeing the things that you and I are seeing. They're not even necessarily the types of people who are super plugged into the 24-hour news cycle and, understand seeing all of these quotes from JD Vance and others that would even show them that they should be concerned, or would even set off the alarms that there is something that they should be concerned about. So I kind of want you to get into more of the specific examples of the types of things that you're seeing right now in online spaces and, in the news cycle. Yeah. But before that, I'm going to depend on you to remember to answer that question because I probably won't circle back to it. But before that, I want to ask you kind of more from a more personal perspective about your life, because what I've noticed, particularly with JD Vance, and he is such a fascinating character to me. I've done a little mini breakdown on him and just kind of helping people to understand this is the type of figure that he is. This is where he comes from. He is a very moneyed figure. He didn't really have a lot of experience. He didn't have any experience legislating before he won the Senate. And he was propped up by Peter Thiel, a billionaire who helped to found PayPal. Peter Thiel put $15 million into JD Vance's Senate campaign after he wrote this book on, called Hillbilly Elegy on Appalachian culture, lower middle class white culture. And so his trajectory has been very interesting. It's been very unusual. And there's been a lot made of the fact that he did not hold the views that he holds now. When he first wrote that book, he was a conservative. He said he was conservative. We understood that, but he was really more of the so-called, George Bush compassionate conservative ilk. That's how he thought of himself, at least. He was a never Trumper. He hated Donald Trump. And he never really seemed to have any interest in being drawn into that circle. But then, like a lot of Republicans before him, the Lindsey Grahams and Ted Cruz's, he's been drawn into Trump's orbit somehow. He has himself been radicalized, it would appear. And I feel like a lot of these comments that we've heard him make around marriage, family, children, he calls himself, I believe the word is natalist, this group of men who I'm sorry?
Pro-natalist, yeah.
Pro-natalist. of which Elon Musk is one. He's got 12 children with multiple baby mamas. There's a growing group of men in particular who believe that it is their job to, be fruitful and multiply, to repopulate the earth. The birth rates are down. We got to get them back up. And, the toxic manifestation of that is that it does somehow and oftentimes slip into a lot of this great replacement theory stuff, even into eugenics. And they're trying to replace white people, and we white people got to have more babies, and the brown people are having too many babies, and this kind of thing. So what JD Vance is preaching right now is feeling very much connected to that world, the Elon Musk world. And I've done a video on him, and all of his white supremacist tendencies. But I feel like a lot of what JD Vance, a lot of what he has to say these days, or what he had to say when he was running for Senate, having to do with the family, having to do with the childless cat ladies, having to do with people with no children having any kind of investment in this country's future. And there are too many of them, and people with no children are miserable. And these horrible things that he has had to say happened when he himself had children. Because as I've observed, I believe his oldest is about 6 years old. This is 2024. That was 2021 when a lot of these statements were being made, when he was running for Senate. His oldest child would have been 2 or 3 years old at that point. And you yourself are a new dad. And so I feel like a lot of the shift, maybe, and I don't know how much of what he preaches is sincere. I don't know how much of it he believes. But a lot of it seemed to happen when he himself became a father. And so can you speak, I guess, from the point of view of a new dad, what that experience has been for you? Do you have any sort of, and I don't want to imply that you have any sort of empathy around things like the great replacement theory or any of this toxic masculinity, but that sense of investment. And I don't know that we should even be taking him, as sincerely as this. But do you feel any understanding or connectedness with that sense of investment in America's future? I am not a parent. And so when I hear someone talk in this way, the way that JD Vance does about having an investment in America's future, these people without children, and we don't, they're not connected in the way we are. Can you speak to that whole issue from the point of view of being a new dad?
Well, because he's actively trying to marginalize you in that process, and specifically in his language, he's trying to marginalize women who have decided not to have children. And so I'm gonna answer this in a couple stages. First and foremost, when it comes to becoming a father, I don't think we should take his claims that his views changing were because he was a father. Sincerely, I don't think we should. Primarily because I think that the views he's expressing now were represented in the views he expressed early in his life. I think they're represented in Hillbilly Elegy. I'll talk about how in a minute. I do think there are ways in which sometimes becoming a parent can amplify certain parts of how somebody was before they became a parent. Because in a lot of ways, when you become a parent, your life simplifies. You have a lot less time to think about a lot of different things. You're focused more narrowly on the well-being of a couple people. So you can kind of hone in a little bit on certain beliefs you might have already had about the world. Me personally, I grew up in a time where, as a young boy, I was spending a lot of time in digital spaces as they were being invented. The precursors to what we see young boys spending a lot of their time on today. And I saw the pathway to this. I heard how boys talked in online gaming. I learned how boys talked to men in online gaming. And a lot of times it was centered around violence against women. And that is what kind of spurs my concern in seeing that fringe behavior spill out into the mainstream, because I know how dangerous it can be. That being said, I also was raised, first of all, predominantly by women. And I was also, I also came up in an environment where many of my close friends were girls and women. So I had defenses built in against misogynistic messaging, if for no other reason than because I knew the way I was hearing women and girls being described did not describe my friends. So it was easy for me to identify it as frankly ridiculous and distorted, right? If you don't have those types of friendships and relationships, it is a lot easier to project what you're hearing from the Andrew Tates of the world onto the women and girls in your lives, because you have never really had access to the inner lives of women and girls. A lot of us were raised by men who did not treat our mothers great, if we had men in our lives at all, right? So there is a void that can be filled by a person like Andrew Tate, who maybe comes across as mainly entertaining at the beginning, but then quickly becomes more insidious than that. A lot of men are, frankly, and I said this in that video, there's a change in how men find status in society. And that's where this opportunity for the misogyny comes from. When it comes to JD Vance is very good at appealing to whoever the most powerful people in the room are at any given time. So that leads him to often look like a chameleon in this way. There was a time where the most powerful person in the room was Paul Ryan, so he was appealing to him. And then the most powerful person in the room became Donald Trump, so he became appealing to him. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the core and foundation of his beliefs have changed. And what I saw in Hillbilly Elegy was a person who loathed poor people, like really, truly loathed poor people. And while he might have been describing and narrating the lives of these poor people in a way that seemed kind of empathetic to somebody who didn't necessarily maybe spend that much time around poor people, what he really was doing for most of that book was blaming their condition on them being low quality people. And I think that the rest of what we're seeing now really stems from that belief that some people are better than others. And what you need to do is maximize the growth of the good part of the population and minimize the growth of the low quality part of the population. Elon believes the same thing. Peter Thiel believes the same thing. That's why they're pronatalists. They think they have a responsibility to compete with the low quality genes in the gene pool, because they see themselves as high quality genes in the gene pool. Not sure how all the time, but they do, right? So there is a way in which this is in line with the views he's always shown us he has about the world. And it comes from, in my personal opinion, being told that somebody like JD Vance should be on top. And we're coming up in an environment where a lot of people like JD Vance were not on top. And he had to rationalize that in some way. And this is how it's happened. But no, I don't necessarily think he has adopted these views to become more appealing. I think that the environment has shifted around him so that he could be more honest about how he already felt about the people around him. And that's kind of what we're seeing come to the forefront.
Wow. Well, like I said, a lot of the folks, I think, who are listening to this conversation may not have any specific concept of the kinds of things that you and I encounter on a daily basis on social media. So can you kind of give some, I guess, specific examples or about the kinds of things that you encounter that would cause the bells and whistles to go off in your head and cause you to be concerned that this sort of kind of toxic masculinity is becoming a major issue on the right?
And I really do think, and I don't mean to try to correct you in saying this, but I do think it's helpful for us to identify it as misogyny. One of the first things that I think would be really helpful for boys is to disconnect this prejudice from masculinity. The toxic masculinity does necessarily exist. It does exist, don't get me wrong, but we have gotten to a point in our society when most often, if we're talking about masculinity at all, It's within the frame of it being toxic. And the truth is that misogyny can be perpetuated by men and women.
Yes.
It's not just perpetuated by men. It's not just a function of masculinity. So just like we talk about racism as racism and xenophobia as xenophobia, we should talk about misogyny as misogyny. And what we should be doing is seeking out a healthy masculinity and promoting a healthy masculinity within our young boys and men. That being said, what we're seeing is policy preferences that are predicated in misogyny and predicated on a red pill view of the world. So I think a good example is recently an interview he did where he was suggesting that people who do not have kids should be taxed at a higher rate than those without kids, and should have less voting power than those who don't have kids. So this is something that would immediately set off an alarm bell, because what it basically means is the target in that is women inherently. A man can have children without anybody necessarily ever knowing, right? Because he could have done it and then never seen that woman again. Whereas a woman cannot avoid the experience of becoming a mother. So really what he's saying is that if women want to maintain their status in society, they better have children. If they want to maintain their voting power, their tax advantage, if they don't want to be discriminated against, they better have children. That right away situates women as being valuable insofar as they are making use of their utility to men. That is an explicitly red pill way of looking at the world. It's telling men that women are owed to you, that their bodies are owed to you, and that your use of them is owed to you. It's the foundation of a policy preference like that. Somebody might look at something like the tax rates and say, isn't that what we already have? We already have tax deductions for children in a all kinds of different ways. And that's true. In a lot of ways we do, but that is different than actually creating a different tax bracket entirely for people who do and don't have children. How do you verify if a man has children? How does the IRS go find out if a man has children to decide how much to tax him? So, and then, there was the line he had on stage recently where he was responding to some racist attacks against his wife, and his response to them was, and I'm pretty sure this is a direct quote, look, I know my wife isn't white. That in of itself, the idea that race would come first in a woman's social standing, right, is that in itself is connected to how a man is judged by what quality woman he has decided to have, right? And what he was trying to do is say, hey, guys, don't worry. My wife is still one of the good ones, even though she's not white. She's still high quality, and I should still be seen as impressive for having a wife, right? Instead of what any normal person would say, shut up. You don't have any right to talk about my wife. She's a wonderful woman, right? You know what I mean? He was ceding the ground to the racists because, and this is the important part, to him, his wife is a reflection of his own standing and really not much more.
Yeah, I found it so interesting that for someone, I find him to be a fascinating character, first of all, because I don't know, there just are so many layers to him. And I think what's happening right now is that he's being outed, but I can't figure out what he's being outed for. I know that this weird label has been thrown around a lot, and Democrats are having a lot of fun with it right now, but I don't know that it necessarily gets to the heart of what's going on with JD Vance. And I've done an entire episode on JD Vance. I don't necessarily want to get too deep in the weeds on him. But what I would like your opinion on what you think of him. What is your impression of him in general? Is this guy, is he a phony? Is he, you've read, it sounds to me like you've read the book, Hillbilly Elegy, and I meant to, I just never got around to it. But what's your impression of him, since he's one of the main figures that's really perpetuating the kind of misogyny, as you say, that we're looking at that's on the rise right now?
Here's what I'll say. JD Vance is not a particularly impressive person to me. He did manage to go to an Ivy League school while not having grown up in a position of privilege, which is an accomplishment, I guess. But in my opinion, the measure of a man is much more than where you got your degree from. And he has shown himself in so many different capacities to be an underachiever, in my opinion. What I think of him being the VP is I think it is a very good example of the differences in how hard one needs to work if they are somebody like JD Vance to become the president's running mate versus if they are somebody like Kamala Harris. He is not accomplished in any way. When he was in school, one of his mentors was the author of Tiger Mom, and that's where he got the idea for his book. He has always ridden the coattails of people who have done more than him and tried to replicate that for his own success. We've all been around people like that. It is by no means remarkable in of itself. It is my hope that he goes down with the Trump ship, and we do not hear much more about him after November. I said, if you do follow me on Threads, you can go see the post I made immediately after his selection was announced. And I think I said something along the lines of, I know we have all gotten out of the habit of acknowledging how bad at politics Donald Trump is, but selecting Prince Red Pill as your VP was a truly horrible choice. It's a truly horrible choice, because what you just said, the reason why they're weird works so well is because these ideas, this misogyny, it belongs in the dark corners of the internet. And the reason why it's only ever flourished there historically is because when you tell normal people about them, they think it's weird. It is weird to want to track women's menstrual cycles. It is weird to want to have different tax brackets for people who do or do not have kids. It is weird to want to limit how women can travel across state lines, as Vance has said we should be doing, so that they can't access reproductive health care if they need it. All of that stuff is blatantly, patently, and obviously weird when you describe it to somebody. It's up until now, it has been laundered through relatively respectable people. And Vance just does not have that credibility. So he hasn't been able to avoid it in the same way others might have in the past.
Yeah. Well, I share your sentiment that, we hope that should this election go in favor of Kamala Harris, that a lot of these figures just sort of drift off into the annals of history. But in my experience, in my observation, there will never be a shortage of demands for mediocre white men. So I'm sure there are speakers bureaus right now that are readying themselves to get him on the road. He will be a very wealthy man, probably for the rest of his life, and he'll be able to capitalize on this regardless. So he'll, at the very least, have financial gain, I think, from his foray into politics. And of course, he is still a sitting senator. He'll still have that influence, for as long as he chooses to, and he will have a great name recognition. I think it's just a kind of a win-win situation for him, regardless. But I want to refocus on the topic at hand as we're kind of coming towards the end of this conversation. I want to ask you, in general, what are some of the things that you feel contribute to loneliness? You kind of honed in on that as being one of the factors that makes this form of misogyny so attractive to young men. What is it that you think is really causing this sort of epidemic of loneliness, is what it sounds like you're referring to in young men right now?
Yeah, so we are getting into troubled waters. So I'm going to tread lightly here, but
make it plain, Gerard.
I think this is actually a really good way in which men are the victims of misogyny in addition to women. Boys are the victim of misogyny in addition to girls. One of the factors in this, in my opinion, is that we have over-indexed on segregating children by their sex. And ironically, I think one of the biggest reasons why we've done that is because of sort of a Puritan idea and fear of sex in a way that, in my opinion, reflects misogyny. Many people are afraid that if you put boys and girls together at the wrong age, things can happen that they don't want to happen. But what happens is that we are withholding from them the opportunities to build healthy platonic relationships with people of the opposite sex and the opposite gender. And we then kind of put them both figuratively and literally in situations where they're really only thinking about each other within the context of romance and sex. Anybody with kids will know that if you have a little boy and a little girl playing, it will not be long before some adult says something about it being a date or something about them being boyfriend and girlfriend. And what you're doing, it seems harmless, and oftentimes it probably is harmless, but what you are doing is teaching them that if they're hanging out, it should probably be within that context. And you're withholding from them the opportunity for this to just be friends, for them to just get to know each other as friends and like each other as friends. And the presence of romance and sex, especially for developing adolescent boys and girls, creates a lot of pressure because they don't know what to do with any of that, right? And then they kind of are going to they might naturally develop a sort of aversion to those relationships because they don't know how to traverse the romance and sex part of it, right? So they start kind of avoiding it altogether. That is one piece of it. I think we should really promote more opportunities for children of different genders and sex to spend more time together, playing, hanging out, enjoying each other's company. When I was in high school, the most important thing to me in high school was journalism. The majority of the staff were women. If I would have said some of this stuff and espoused some of these beliefs, I would have been checked real quick, right? And if your friend groups are only ever other boys, you're just a sitting duck for a lot of these things. Another aspect to this is that it is a lot easier for boys to have the majority, if not their entire social network, in digital spaces. That was accelerated by the pandemic, and digital spaces are different than physical spaces. We behave, we say, and we do things differently in digital spaces than we would do if we were in arm's length of somebody. If we had to see the look on somebody's face when we said what we just said, if we had to hear how it made them feel when we said what we just said. Different social muscles atrophy, and when they atrophy for long enough, it results in a fear and reticence around building close relationships. One of the things that I think is just really important to keep in mind when it comes to this conversation is that when we're talking about the loneliness of boys, we're not just talking about the lack of romantic relationships. We're talking about the lack of intimate connections in general. Close emotional relationships in general with other men, with other women, both within the context of friendship and in the context of romance, and often within the context of parenthood, within the context of role models, people to look up to. All of these voids are created, and each void is an opportunity for misogynistic radicalization. So I think when we're thinking about those contributions, we really need to think about, are we teaching our young boys how to connect with their own emotions, how to connect with their friends' emotions, how to get to know themselves and other people on a real human level? And are we destigmatizing boys being emotional creatures, being people who feel? Or are we in one way, shape, or form teaching them to repress those things so that when they do get in spaces where they do feel safe and free to express them, the one that is most encouraged to express is rage and anger. We want to build tools in these young men and boys to be whole people from the jump, so that we're not trying to repair them as JD Vance's.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think, first of all, what do you think the hope is that we are able to sort of right the ship a bit? Because what you're speaking of are foundational solutions that don't necessarily help us in the here and now with this generation of young men and boys. What do you think the chances are that we're able to take some corrective measures in the here and now? And then the other thing I want to ask you, which I hope we can get to before we have to wrap up, is what impact do you think that this is having on the current election cycle? So first, I'll ask you, what are some opportunities that we have to impact this phenomenon for the better in the here and now?
So I'll start with what we can do in our own interpersonal relationships. And I'm going to speak specifically to men when I say this. Go to therapy and talk to your friends about therapy. Make yourself a space where these conversations can be had, and do what you can to destigmatize mental health in the relationships you have with other men. We need coaches in a lot of this stuff, and there are professionals out here who can help us learn more about ourselves and learn more about how to access our feelings. Right? I know that that's easier said than done. Access to healthcare is a problem, and it's something from a policy standpoint that we could improve on to help aid in this situation. But if you do have access, take advantage of that access and leverage it. Men can also get into their communities a little bit more. I think when it comes to volunteering at the local school, I was an intern in a low-income elementary school when I was in college. And when I became an intern, I also became the third man on campus. And that's a problem. That's a problem. We need more adult men that children can see just being normal contributors to society. Boys and girls clubs, your YMCA, be a volunteer. Just be a volunteer. Volunteer work is too often seen as women's work in this country, in our society. When it comes to policy, and some of this kind of crosses over into culture as well. One of the reasons why there is so much vitriol against the changes in women's status in society as it pertains to men's status in society is because women have shown much more flexibility in reconsidering what a woman's job is. We see a lot more women in jobs that 30 years ago were thought more to be men jobs than the opposite, right? There are a lot more female accountants than there are necessarily male elder care workers. And we all need to start participating in the effort to change that. There to a much less degree than ever there has been before, there are not masculine and feminine jobs. We can all do them all. Earning an income and a livelihood is respectable in of itself. And we need to celebrate men who are stepping outside the box to pursue opportunities to thrive and prosper, and not necessarily feel like they're limited to jobs that are historically quote unquote male jobs, right? And we also need to welcome men into those spaces. We need to not think it's weird for a man to be a nanny. We need to not think it's weird for a man to be a nurse. We need to not think it's weird for a man to be a teacher. You know, how often have you seen comments about like, it's weird for men to want to be around kids that much? I've seen it plenty. It's inappropriate. We need to stop doing that because we are locking men out of some of the highest growth employment opportunities in our economy. And that contributes to the disaffection. And then I would also just say that we should be mindful about our cultural and artistic expressions. There are a lot of examples in media and art of men solving their problems by becoming insular and violent. I think the example that always comes to mind for me, even though I'm not going to lie, I love this movie, I love this actor, I love this franchise, but John Wick. His wife dies in a tragedy. He is struggling to cope and recover from his grief and his loss. And basically how he does it is to go on a murderous rampage all alone, right? And that is a motif in our culture. That's a motif. It is looked at that being a man means being stoic, being quiet, being alone, and not needing other people. And we need to start changing that. We need to start creating a market for different stories to tell about what it means to be a man and what it means to be masculine.
Yeah. Such great practical advice, Gerard. And one of the reasons that I feel, like I said, that men need to be leading this conversation, I feel like I've learned a lot. And the last thing I want to ask you, though, Gerard, is, there has been such goodwill already for Kamala Harris during this election season. She's really only been out there, a week or 10 days or something like that thus far as of this conversation as the presumed nominee for the party. And I, was talking to someone this morning about kind of not falling into the trap or the pitfall of necessarily having to respond to all of the negative things being put out there right now, coming from her opposition, coming from Trump, coming from JD Vance or whomever, the folks that are out there opposing her. We need to be able to keep our positive momentum, keep our positive energy, and not allow that sort of negative vortex to suck us up into, not allow ourselves to be sucked up into that negative vortex, because it's very easy, and I think a lot of us right now are still very much on edge and wondering how all of this will shake down, wondering how all of it will play out. Can she keep her momentum? Is the sort of Trump, chaos, whatever cloud going to overtake all of this positive energy? Where will we be in 3 months when the election comes along? So I guess I want you to speak lastly to the idea of this, misogynist kind of thing, this energy and its impact, its potential impact on this election. Do you feel that this is something that is going to have an impact on the upcoming election? How concerned are you that the positive momentum that Kamala Harris has been able to achieve in these first couple of weeks, how concerned are you that it may succumb to a lot of this negative energy that we've been speaking about? Because I don't know, it's just such a contrast for me to watch her, the physicality of her, and just the humanity of her, the way that she smiles, how much she laughs, the effervescence. It is so unpolitical. There's a humanity in her that comes through. And I think a lot of people, even people on the left, even progressives, they're uncomfortable with it. And they consider it to be kind of unpresidential,
when it's a woman,
dignified. We said when it's a woman. Yes. Yes, her femininity, the matronly, air that she carries, all of that. We are deeply uncomfortable with that, I think. And I've heard people seen people even in my comment section going, well, if she meets with Vladimir Putin, he's not going to take her seriously. Trump literally said at that National Association of Black Journalists thing, which I have no idea why that went down, why it happened at all. But it's definitely been ripe with quotables, and the news, 24-hour news media is eating it up. But he even said, in that interview that he did, well, leaders aren't going to take her seriously, or he might have said it in another interview. And he said, you're just looking at her. Yeah. Leaders are not going to take her seriously. And I don't think I need to tell you why. I know why they're not going to take her seriously. He said, looking at her. So I think there is the concern, of these, it is kind of a cartoonish concern, I guess, on my part and the part of many people, that this smiling, effervescent, bubbly woman who is not afraid of her femininity and who is not afraid of her positivity just in general might be eaten up by this big bad wolf. And all of the negativity that comes with it, and this, misogyny that we're speaking of, that's happening on the right. So just kind of, I guess, talk to me from that perspective and maybe allay some of my fears, Gerard, because I can't help but be concerned about the optics of it and the reality of it just being a woman, a Black woman in the world. It's like, is this woman of color going to be okay? Are we going to be okay?
I'm about to use a strange analogy, but stick with me.
Okay.
When you're thinking about your diet and when you're thinking about what you eat, oftentimes we are told to be careful with things like sugar and carbs because they make things taste good, but they can have ill effects on the back end. And when you're trying to figure out how to structure a diet where you can indulge in those things and it still be relatively healthy, one of the things that you will come across often is the idea that you should have a very high fiber diet, because that can help cleanse everything that you might have overindulged on. I think when you look at Kamala Harris and how she campaigns and how she carries herself, a lot of times the positivity, the humanism that she conveys that we love about her feels like the sugar and carbs, because it does feel like it can make her vulnerable in the way that you're describing. What I would posit, what I might suggest, is that her fiber is her confidence. It's not like anything I've seen from another female candidate for an office like that. It's an effortless confidence. Did you see the if you have something to say it to my face?
Yes, of course.
The way she pointed to herself while smiling, and how it looked like she, in that moment, she was not feeling a pound of the weight of the world. She was in her own confidence, and she was knowing in that moment that she's built for this.
Yes.
And I think that confidence is infectious. And I think sometimes it will get in the way of wondering whether or not somebody is ready for this before the thought even comes in. There are some people who will always be worried about a woman being in those positions, and there's not much more we can do about that than having a woman be in that position and it be okay. Absolutely. But for a lot of people that don't really know, when they see, she looks presidential. She looks like she's done this before.
Yes.
And there have been candidates in the past who looked like they were trying to convince us that they were confident.
Man, that is such an astute observation, Gerard.
Harris just is. She just is. And it's part of the growth that I mentioned earlier, because I don't think she's always necessarily had that. But what we take for granted is that she's spent the last 4 years in this administration practicing. It's what she's been doing. And she's grown a lot. Her skills have grown a lot. And when she's up there, she just looks ready. She sounds, she looks, she acts ready. And I think that will convey to enough people that we don't necessarily have to be so paranoid about the sexism. All of that being said, there's two things I want to add on here. One, thank you for I saw your Threads post this morning. It checked me as well. Donald Trump is very good. The one that you said about the feeding the negativity. Yes. Donald Trump is very good about making himself the heel, going out there and acting a fool just to get the attention back. Absolutely. And we need to be careful not always to give him the attention.
Yes.
So one, let's be mindful about that. Let's try our best to make sure we're making the case for Harris more often than we're making the case against Trump.
Yes.
I need to get better at that. I think we all need to get better at that, but it helps her stay on offense.
Yes. Yes.
2, try to resist 2016 PTSD.
Yes.
When you're seeing your fellow people in your coalition excited, optimistic, dare I say confident that we might win this thing, try not to squash that. Because I'm seeing so many people say, don't say that. Don't get overconfident. We still got to go vote. We got to act like we're losing. Don't act like you're losing. Right? Optimism is important.
Yes.
And pessimism can be just as much of a liability, if not more, than optimism.
Yes.
So what I've been encouraging people is, if you're worried about that kind of language, try saying, if somebody says he's toast, try saying, yeah, let's go vote, instead of saying, no, don't say that.
Right.
Just try your best not to get into the false idea that what happened in 2016 was inevitable, because it wasn't.
Yeah.
And she can win. We can win. And we need to be as confident as she is.
Yeah. Well, I take strength from your confidence. I take strength from your posts, your observations. I often say to people when I'm speaking about it, people say that they take strength from the things I put out there, but they don't know. It's like I'm feeling, really good about things, and then I have these private moments where I'm questioning and I'm wondering, and then I need other people. I need to hold on to other people's energy and their positivity and their belief and their strength. So I always kind of look for those life rafts in the water, and you're one of those, Gerard. So I really appreciate the way that you are helping me, and as well as many other people, kind of think through this process and understand where it is that we are. We certainly don't consider ourselves to be at the finish line by any means, but I think we all have our wits about us. I think we know the challenges that are ahead, and we're ready to take them on. And I'm finding a lot of strength even in watching Kamala, as you said, just watching her confidence and watching her almost as just like we watched Barack Obama, that feeling and that confidence that they carry with them, that they know that they were built for this moment. They know what this moment is, and they kind of know that they were created to live into it. And so it's just a beautiful synergy to be observing, to be witnessing, and to be a part of. I'm already hearing people say, and not to get into a place of overconfidence, but I'm already hearing people say that they're looking forward to purchasing, or that they are purchasing trips to Washington, D.C. And we just haven't seen this kind of for the inauguration, we haven't seen this kind of energy and enthusiasm in a long time, and I think we have been missing that in our politics, at least on the left with progressive voters. And so, I think it's just a new feeling. It's kind of a strange feeling for a lot of us to feel positivity.
Lean in
and enjoy.
Real quick before we wrap up, if you don't mind, before we wrap up, I'd like to make a couple quick recommendations, because this is a really serious topic that we covered today. And the truth is that neither of us are experts. And this is a place where I think average, everyday people need to be talking about it. But it is important to also seek out expertise.
Yes.
So if people want to know more about the topics we were talking about today, I recommend an author named Laura Bates. She has a book called Men Who Hate Women. She went undercover into the online spaces where a lot of this content comes from, and she learned about it and reported on it. I want to be completely honest to the audience that it is a really difficult read. There's some rough stuff in there, but especially if you're the parent of boys, I think you need to know that it's out there. You need to know what your boys are up against, frankly. Also,
what's the name of the book again and the author, please?
It's Laura Bates, Men Who Hate Women.
Okay.
And then another one is Richard Reeves of Boys and Men. It goes into a lot of the changing economic and social landscape around men in the last few decades that contribute to some of that disaffection. And it gives you a very good sense of what the conditions actually are right now, not necessarily how we talk about them, but what they actually are. And I think it can help a lot of people reframe how they look at men in general. And it gives them a little bit of a permission structure to understand that there are systemic problems that men are facing. And then finally, I'm sure this is no news to you, but The Will to Change by Bell Hooks. it is a truly indispensable read. It conveys a feminism that is compassionate of men. And I think any successful feminism is compassionate of men because it treats men like people. And feminism is all about people thriving. So I encourage people, again, especially if they have young boys, read it yourself. You're going to cry a lot, but read it yourself, and then decide when your sons are old enough to read it with you. It's a short read, but it's very, very important.
Okay, can you give me the names of those books and authors once again, all three?
Yep, it's Men Who Hate Women by Laura Bates. It's On Boys or Of Boys and Men by Richard Reeves, and The Will to Change by Bell Hooks.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I really appreciate you taking time to talk through a lot of these issues with us, Gerard. These are not easy subjects to tackle, but I think that you do such a good job of helping us to get our heads around it. And it's so important. And I don't think it's being talked about enough. And when it isn't necessarily talked about with the compassion that you bring to the subject. So I appreciate your point of view, and I appreciate the video that you made about it. And it's so important. I'm so glad it caught online and that it kind of took off and gained virality. And so I hope it helps a lot of folks, and I think it will. So thank you for being on. Once again, Gerard, please give the folks your contact information and let them know how they can find you online.
Gerard.LeConte, that's GerardLeconte, Gerard.LeConte on TikTok, and Gerard LeConte Politics on Instagram and Threads. As always, the feeling is mutual, Dara. Thank you so much for having me on. I can't wait till next time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Well, thank you all for joining us here on The Breakdown on KJLH. You can find me on the KJLH Instagram page at KJLH Radio on Instagram. You can also find me on my personal page on Instagram at Dara Tucker B. Everywhere else at Dara Star Tucker. That's Dara with one R and Star with two. Thank you so much for joining me here on The Breakdown. I will see you the same time, same place next week. We're tackling the issues that are very difficult, but we are tackling them one issue at a time. We can do this, folks. We can push this boulder up the hill, and we can push it over the hill. I want us to keep our positivity about us. Make sure that you go to the link in my bio on my social media and check your voter registration. Make sure that is in order. You can go to vote.org/Dara to check your voter registration. There are people that are being purged from voter rolls all the time. So please do that if you are able. Make sure that is in order long before the election comes around. So thank you very much for joining me. Look forward to seeing you all next week. And until then, let's learn to shout.